In the early 2000s, Nintendo was facing new challenges thanks to Microsoft entering the gaming market with the Xbox, and the PlayStation 2 continuing to capitalize on the success of the new Sony brand. Something had to change. Going head-to-head in terms of the same capabilities and powers, which is what the GameCube was all about, wasn't working. Stock was piling up, and Sony was taking a very large lead. Nintendo had to innovate or die. Innovation has always been at the heart of Nintendo. In the early 1880s, Japan had banned most forms of gambling, except a specific type of card called Hanafuda. The reason being was they lacked numbers or values, and implicitly would be harder to gamble with. Seeing this loophole, Nintendo's founder, Fusajio Yamauchi, an artisan from Kyoto, established Nintendo to produce and distribute Hanafuda cards. Little did they know, a gaming star was being born. Yamauchi being an artisan is not a surprise. Kyoto, once the political center and the cultural center of Japan, has historically maintained some of the most premier craftsmanship and artistry in the world. The term Kyoto craftsmanship has been coined because of it, and it's a spirit and idea with deep roots at Nintendo's core, roots that have flourished into the company's excellence that we know today. Leveraging that Kyoto craftsmanship, Nintendo entered the home console market in the mid-1980s and captivated audiences, essentially stabilizing and resuscitating the home video game market. Their approach ushered in over a decade plus of success. From the Nintendo Entertainment System and the dawn of Super Mario Bros. On home televisions, to the innovation of portable gaming with the Nintendo Game Boy, to the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, and so much more. Almost any kid who grew up in the late 80s and 90s knows what Nintendo is all about. But with the dawn of the new millennium, new players had entered the game, and the stranglehold Nintendo had on the video game market was starting to wane. Historically, Nintendo was able to balance a fine line between quality, affordability, and innovation. But with Microsoft and Sony now entering the market, two companies with large bankrolls of capital and core competencies within technology and hardware innovation, the market was starting to shift. Developers and publishers preferred Sony's platform as game production was cheaper thanks to discs being used, which led to higher profit margins. On top of that, with the PlayStation 2, Sony packed in a DVD player, a new medium at the time for consumption of media that was quickly taking off. Microsoft, on the other hand, had a steep hill to climb. But with the utilization of the DirectX architecture, developers who were already busy in the PC gaming space were quite familiar with the Xbox's system and tools. On top of that, with their specialty in IT and networking, Microsoft, while losing the race in terms of total consoles sold, would end up establishing the first premier online gaming service, Xbox Live. That, with the advent of Halo and Halo 2, gamers who grew up with Nintendo were simply moving on to more power and more mature games. In fact, when former president of Nintendo North America, Reggie Fils-Aimé, came on board as head of marketing in the early 2000s, he noticed the challenge facing the Red Giant in his own home. In his book Disrupting the Game, he recalls how, throughout the 90s, it was always a Nintendo console in their family's living room. But lately, he had to make room for a PlayStation 2, and eventually an Xbox, but no GameCube ever joined. This is where the innovator's dilemma comes into play. For the first time in a while, Nintendo wasn't the immediately preferred console. Even though it had more power than some of its competitors at the time, the Nintendo GameCube wasn't up to snuff for what gamers wanted in that moment. So they had to face the question, do we continue to compete in a market that is well established and quite busy, or do we tap into a new market, or even create our own? This was the answer. How they got there is something we're all familiar with. Rather than choosing to fight head-to-head with their competitors, Nintendo chose a different path. From the late 90s onward, they noticed video games tended to become more complicated. Controllers required more buttons and obtuse layouts, and games had come a far away from the heyday of a D-pad, start, select, and A and B button. Nintendo felt therein lied their opportunity, and this is where the Nintendo DS comes into play. With the Game Boy line, Nintendo held dominance in the handheld market throughout the entirety of the 90s, but even though the Game Boy Advance was successful, Sony also had their eyes on the handheld market. They had recently introduced the PSP, and leveraging their hardware and technology capabilities, they brought a high-end, highly powerful handheld device with home console-like quality to the market. The Game Boy Advance just didn't match up head-to-head, but with the DS, Nintendo was going to call an audible on the entire situation. Rather than creating more complex ways to play, Nintendo wanted to tap into a new market and bring in non-traditional gamers. This involved creating new ways to play as well, and with the DS, not only could you play your traditional type of game, but thanks to its highly functional and affordable touchscreen, it attracted many people who never even thought about buying a gaming device. Before the DS, touchscreens were only available on Palm Pilots or similar devices. They were rather obtuse to use and cost quite a bit. Plus, they were typically associated with commercial or business use. But the DS changed everything. Kids started to complain that their parents were hogging their DS. More so, kids who were never interested in games were now highly inclined thanks to non-traditional software like Nintendogs. And grandparents wanted a DS because of games like Brain Age. The casual gamer was born. Years before mom and dad would be playing Candy Crush on their iPhones, Nintendo started to tap into that new market, and it was only the beginning. Their next home console, codenamed Revolution, was promising to bring a similar change of events to that segment of the market, and it involved a similar strategy. They wanted to appeal to the traditional gamer who grew up playing Zelda, Metroid, and now even Halo, but also to those who would never be caught with the controller in their hand, except perhaps a TV controller. And that was the inspiration for the Wii remote. The Nintendo Wii ushered in similar success. Grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, and all of the siblings could be found around the TV during the holidays thanks to games like Wii Sports. And again, people who would never be seen with the video game were running out to the store to pick up software like Wii Fitness. The revolution, as promised, had occurred. And thanks to the powerhouse of their existing IPs like The Legend of Zelda and new IPs, Nintendo had managed to not only appeal to the traditional gamer, but expand the market into new territories. And thanks to their continued focus on affordability, the new gamers who wanted a unit could easily afford a DS or a Wii over the competitors at the time. At the end of it all, Nintendo would go on to see a total of 101 million units sold for the Nintendo Wii, and a whopping total of 154 million units sold for the Nintendo DS, placing them at 7th and 2nd respectively for best-selling consoles of all time. Those numbers were also miles away from Nintendo's previous two releases, the GameCube at 21 million units sold, and the Game Boy Advance at a still impressive 81.5 million units sold. On top of that, compared to its competitors, the DS blew away the PSP by the end of it all, and the Nintendo Wii would go on to be the best-selling console of that 7th generation, beating out the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. So there you have it. When faced with the pressure of new competition, rather than doubling down on their existing strategy, Nintendo decided to switch it up and branch off into ever new territories. This is the innovator's dilemma. And companies that embrace this problem and use it to level set with the realities around them typically find a way to continue thriving. It takes a consistent culture of excellence, though, and as we know, this is a culture that's been at Nintendo's core since its founding. A culture that prides craftsmanship and taking advantage of the opportunities that lay ahead of it.